And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Aviation Weather Outlook on this Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. And this outlook will be for Thursday and Friday, and the main weather features we're going to be dealing with is a persistent area of low pressure over the Gulf. It does have a feed of moisture coming up out of the North Pacific that will impact areas, especially along the northeastern Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. Coastal, lower elevation rains, breezy conditions. You'll get some snow, mid-upper levels of the coastal mountains. Back to the west, there's also a low way out toward the western Aleutians with a weakening front arcing through the lower Bering and pushing across the eastern Aleutians by the time we get into Thursday morning. The other thing we could see here the next couple of days, now that we are well into April with the stronger daytime heating, we get more in the way of some convective clouds, and there could be some pop-up showers, especially along some of the terrain here in southeast mainland, including the area around McCarthy, up maybe into the upper Tanana Valley. And that could even include a isolated flash, a lightning rumble of thunder. So IFR conditions are expected northern Panhandle into Yakutat Bay there for Thursday morning. We find IFR conditions along the North Slope, especially between Point Lay and Dead Horse, and then also IFR conditions Bering Strait along the lower Yukon Delta, Nunavik Island, eastern Aleutians. For Thursday afternoon, there's that potential for an isolated thunder shower popping up along parts of the eastern Alaska Range, upper portion of the Tanana Valley, and here down over southeast Wrangell, St. Elias Mountains, McCarthy area. Still a pocket of IFR up in the northern Panhandle there around Haines and Skagway upward into Yukon, or I should say the Klondike Highway. And then along the spine of the Brooks Range could be some IFR conditions. Anatuvik, Adigan passes a little west of there. Broad area of IFR over the central Bering, including St. Matthew, St. Paul, Nunavik Island. And then for Friday morning, IFR conditions along the intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, including there the British Columbia Mountains, and then up through pockets of the Tanana Valley, 40-mile Gold Country, Central Alaska Range around Isabel Pass. There could be some IFR toward McCarthy, or I should say McGrath. And then we have IFR along the central North Slope and much of the Arctic coast. Also, again, from the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island down through Nunavik Island, YK deltas into western portion of Bristol Bay and covering much of the central southern areas of the Bering Sea and across the central eastern Aleutians. For Friday afternoon, we could still see a pop-up thunderstorm in the vicinity of, say, Mentasta Pass, and still a little few pockets of IFR inner coastal mountains above Juneau, Petersburg. And then as we look to the north, still that pocket of IFR out over the central portion of the North Slope and still out over areas of the eastern Bering, especially off of Kuskokwim Bay, and then north of the central and eastern Aleutians. Past conditions on Thursday, Anatuvik Pass is looking to be IFR becoming MVFR. Southern areas could see, once you fly south of the south entrance, they're becoming VFR Thursday afternoon. Adigan Pass, IFR conditions early becoming MVFR on Thursday. Heading on down toward the west arm of the Alaska Range, Lake Clark should generally be VFR. Merrill also VFR, but it could become MVFR with the daytime heating, especially into the afternoon. Right now, Rainy Pass up through Windy Pass looks MVFR. Isabel Pass also MVFR conditions on Thursday. Further east, Mentasta Pass may start out down there in IFR conditions becoming MVFR. Across the Copper River Basin, Tanita Pass should generally see MVFR conditions on Thursday. And then Portage Pass, generally MVFR conditions through the heart of the pass out toward Prince William Sound, the west entrance, generally VFR. And then finally, in the far north end of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White will likely hold on to IFR conditions on Thursday. Freezing levels at the surface run across the central Bering south of St. Matthew and Nunavik Island, coming inland there around the west side of Bristol Bay, and then up through Cook Inlet as you bump up against the coastal mountains, and then across the northeastern Gulf Coast up into Yakutat Bay and then into western Canada. Freezing levels aloft do come upward a bit, 2,000 feet, 4,000 feet. There's southern panhandle Haida Gwaii. And then with that frontal system that's out here to the west, we have freezing levels bump upwards around and just a bit above 4,000 feet. Eastern Aleutians on up into the lower Alaska Peninsula. There's going to be an area of low pressure that just kind of persists in this region through the end of the week. And with that precipitation, there's that feed of moisture. Rain along the coast, still some wet snow in the mid-upper elevations of the coastal mountains, especially icing potential, moderate icing above 6,000 feet there, northeastern Gulf Coast, northern half the Panhandle, may even be slightly higher freezing levels aloft there, so icing above maybe 8,000 feet there in the far southern Panhandle. And then with this weakening front that extends back out across the Bering Sea, generally there could be some moderate icing above 6,000 feet in the vicinity of St. Paul and above 8,000 feet across the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, with an area potentially colder air aloft with the low sitting back here. You can find some moderate icing above 4,000 feet, parts of the central western Aleutians, especially around Adak westward to Shemya. Upper level jet stream winds at 30,000 feet we find ridging here out into southwest Canada, and southerly flow upwards of 60-70 knots across the Panhandle. Northwesterly flow across from Cook Inlet down through the lower Gulf, and then as we go back to the west, you can see a circulation associated with that low, at least in the upper levels. 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, we find the mid-levels, that low circulation over the central Gulf, that's forcing southerly flow 30-40 knots there at 9,000 feet across, especially central northern Panhandle into the lower Yukon. We have an area of easterly winds at mid-levels, 30-35 knots, western portion of the north slope into the upper Chukchi Sea, and then behind me we have this circulation just north of the western Aleutians. Strongest winds are south of the Aleutians in the North Pacific, 40-50 knots. And then as we drop things down to 3,000 feet, we have the low circulation in the central Gulf with winds around 30 knots along areas of the offshore, say, of Sitka, but especially there as we get up outside of Elfin Cove and up toward Yakutat. As we go north and west, easterly winds 30 to as high as 45 knots off the Lisburn Peninsula near Cape Lisburn. And then a broader circulation you can see around the low that's just north of the Aleutians in the lower Bering, with that front extending eastward. Broad belt winds 35-40 knots across the central areas of the Bering Sea, and then down south of the Aleutians, northwest to westerly winds 40 to locally as high as 50 knots. And the greatest threat for turbulence on Thursday will be associated with that low over the Gulf along outer areas, especially Sitka on up toward Yakutat, Cape Suckling. There could be some moderate turbulence, surface to 6,000 feet, could even be a bit of some low-level wind shear in this region. North and west, we find some moderate turbulence coming off of the north side of the Brooks Range coming through Cape Lisburn, surface to 4,000 feet. And then finally, way out to the west, there is the potential for some moderate turbulence for areas of the western Aleutians, especially west of Adak through Shemya and Kiska, surface to 3,000 feet on Thursday.